In the quiet spaces of your mind, where thoughts drift like shadows searching for form, something unsettling begins to stir. You may believe you understand yourself, your memories, your choices, your motives, but beneath that fragile surface lies a landscape shaped by traps you never notice, patterns you never agreed to, and illusions that silently rewrite who you think you are. Consciousness is not a stable reflection, it is a shifting mirror, bending its own edges each time you look into it. And as you explore deeper, the mind reveals its hidden architecture, spirals, echoes, glitches, distortions, subtle yet powerful enough to reshape your entire sense of existence. Tonight, you will step into those unseen corners, not to escape them, but to finally witness how your mind creates, destroys, and recreates your reality every second, even when you believe you're in control. You notice it first as a small return, a quiet repetition of an idea you thought you'd already processed. It comes back like an echo with unfinished business, nudging your awareness again, then again, as if something inside you refuses to let the moment dissolve. A memory, a worry, a prediction, a possibility. Anything can become the seed, and once the seed settles, the mind begins its silent work, looping the same thought until it grows roots that pierce the deeper layers of your consciousness. This is the looping thought trap, the mental vortex that convinces you that repetition equals importance, and importance equals danger. You don't choose to fall into it. You simply find yourself circling the same internal point, unable to break free. The trap works in a simple, yet devastating way. Each time the thought returns, it triggers a small emotional ripple. That ripple creates a sense of urgency, and urgency signals your mind that something unresolved demands attention. But the unresolved thing is rarely real. It is usually an illusion, an imagined future, a distorted interpretation, a memory sharpened by fear. Yet your mind, trying to protect you, shines a spotlight on it. And under that spotlight, the thought becomes louder, heavier, more convincing. You begin to feel as if not thinking about it would be irresponsible, as if ignoring it could let something terrible slip through the cracks. So the loop tightens. You replay conversations that have already ended, searching for mistakes and dangers that were never there. You revisit scenarios that cannot be changed, as if staring long enough will rewrite history. You imagine futures that have no evidence, but you believe the fear because it feels familiar. You turn the same idea over and over until it becomes a shape that only exists in your mind, yet influences your decisions, your emotions, your sense of reality. What makes the looping thought trap so deceptive is that it comes disguised as reflection. It feels like analysis, like responsibility, like preparation. You think you're being careful, you think you're solving something. But the loop wasn't built to reach solutions. It was built to feed on uncertainty. Each time you revisit the thought, your brain unconsciously strengthens the neural pathway that carries it. And with every repetition, the idea gains more authority. Not because it is true, but because it is familiar. Familiarity becomes proof, and proof becomes fear, and fear becomes the fuel that keeps the loop spinning. Eventually the trap begins shaping your identity. You start believing that you are a person who overthinks, a person who worries too much, a person whose mind never stops. But you are not the cause, only the host. The looping mechanism operates independently of your will, like background code running on a system you never learned to program. Your brain doesn't ask permission to repeat thoughts, it repeats them because repetition is its default survival strategy. What feels like a flaw in your character is merely a glitch in your wiring. There is a moment, though, when you start noticing the pattern. You observe the loop, not from inside it, but from a distance. You see the rhythm, the return, the worry, the interpretation, the tightening coil. And for a brief second, the spell breaks. You realize that the thought itself was never the threat. The real trap was the belief that thinking more would fix what thinking created in the first place. But even that realization doesn't free you completely, because the looping thought trap has a second layer, the loop about the loop. You begin thinking about your overthinking, worrying about your worrying, creating a new spiral around the first. Now you are trapped in a meta loop, believing that escaping your own mind requires controlling what arises inside it. Yet control is the very thing that strengthens the cycle. The more you try to force the thought away, the more it returns with renewed urgency. Resistance becomes attachment, effort becomes fuel, the struggle becomes the loop. And still, beneath all the noise, there is a quiet truth you rarely hear. A looping thought is not asking to be solved. It is asking to be seen without fear. When you stop fighting the repetition, stop trying to decode it, fix it, or silence it, the loop begins to lose its power. Awareness interrupts the automatic rhythm. Instead of you orbiting the thought begins orbiting you. It becomes something observed rather than something that defines you. The loop does not end in a dramatic collapse. It dissolves gently, like mist, realizing it no longer has a shape to hold. But until that moment arrives, the looping thought trap continues reshaping your consciousness, bending your perception of time, magnifying small worries into vast shadows, and convincing you that thinking is the only way to feel safe. And the deeper you fall, the more you forget that safety never comes from the loop. It comes from stepping outside it, even for a breath. Yet the mind is patient. It waits for the next trigger. And the loop, like a familiar rhythm, begins again. Unless you choose to meet it with awareness instead of fear. Consciousness carries a fragile sense of self, a thread connecting memories, thoughts, and sensations into what you call I. But what happens when that thread begins to fray? When the solidity of identity dissolves into something indistinct, fluid, and ungraspable? This is the dissolving identity pitfall, a mental abyss where the boundaries of who you are blur and fade, leaving only awareness floating in a void of uncertainty. At first, it is subtle, a fleeting doubt about a decision, a sudden disconnect from your own preferences, a momentary unfamiliarity with your reflection in the mirror. But these small fissures widen, whispering that perhaps the self you cling to is not as fixed as you believed. The mind, conditioned to maintain a coherent narrative, recoils at the first signs of dissolution. Yet the more it resists, the stronger the sensation of slipping becomes. You may find yourself questioning why you think certain thoughts, why you feel certain emotions, or even why you exist in this body at all. Familiar habits, the routines that once defined your daily life, begin to feel alien. Conversations with others carry a strange weight, as if the connection is mediated by an identity that is no longer fully yours. The dissolving identity pitfall does not attack your mind with violence. It unravels it quietly, leaving a soft, eerie emptiness that hums beneath consciousness. Time itself begins to feel altered. Moments of clarity flicker and fade like distant stars, leaving gaps filled by echoes of who you were and who you imagined yourself to be. Memories, once anchors of identity, become unreliable, their edges blurred by doubt. You may remember doing something you never did, or forget something that was central to your sense of self. Even your thoughts feel borrowed, as if someone else is speaking through you, guiding the narrative you once thought was yours. And in that space, fear begins to creep, not fear of external events, but of the loss of the I that you believed was permanent. The pitfall is not merely a psychological curiosity. It is a test of awareness. Your mind attempts to label, categorize, and reconstruct identity to regain balance. Yet every attempt reveals the fragility of the construct. Friends and family, once mirrors reflecting a stable version of yourself, now seem distorted, their reflections misaligned with your inner perception. A single question, who am I really, can become a spiral, leading deeper into uncertainty. In this pitfall, identity is a mirage, perpetually forming and dissolving, a phenomenon that cannot be fully captured or controlled. At its core, the dissolving identity pitfall confronts you with the paradox of consciousness. You exist, yet the sense of you is never fixed. You are a constant observer in a shifting landscape of fleeting selves. The challenge lies not in reclaiming a permanent identity, because none exists in absolute terms, but in learning to inhabit the flux without panic. Awareness becomes the anchor, the still point from which the self can be observed without clinging. You start noticing that thoughts, emotions, and memories arise and fall like waves, but they are not the ocean itself. You are the ocean, the boundless awareness in which the waves appear and disappear. As the pitfall deepens, the illusion of control fades. You may feel disoriented, as if the world no longer responds to your usual sense of self. Decisions that once seemed automatic require deliberate attention, and habitual reactions feel foreign. Even familiar places and faces carry an uncanny tone, as if you are simultaneously present and absent. The mind resists, attempting to solidify a version of self, but every attempt exposes the inherent instability. The more you grasp, the more it slips. The more you identify, the more you fragment. And yet, within this very dissolution lies an invitation, a subtle revelation, that consciousness is not the ownership of a single unchanging identity, but a flowing awareness that adapts, observes, and transforms. Ultimately, surviving the dissolving identity pitfall does not mean restoring a fixed self. It means learning to witness the continuous drift, to recognize that I is a temporary arrangement of thoughts, emotions, and memories always in motion. It is a confrontation with impermanence at the deepest level, an experience that reshapes how you relate to every thought, every emotion, every action. You realize that stability is not found in the self, but in the capacity to observe its endless variations. In that observation, fear loosens its grip, and a strange freedom emerges. The awareness that you are not bound by any single version of who you are, yet you are present, undeniably alive, and endlessly aware. Inside every mind, there exists a constant voice, a narrator, weaving together moments, decisions, and reflections into a story that feels like you. This is not an external voice, but a mental construct, a stream of commentary that seems inseparable from your identity. Yet what if that voice is not truth, not guidance, but a persistent illusion? Illusion of internal narrator is a mental pitfall that convinces you that this commentary defines reality, that the stories it tells are fact rather than interpretation. It begins subtly, a quiet suggestion, a judgment on your actions, a narrative framing of an event you barely remember, and slowly, without warning, it grows into the dominant lens through which you perceive every experience. The narrator's voice feels logical, rational, and intimate. It recounts your past, predicts your future, and evaluates your present as if you could not function without it. But closer observation reveals cracks, opinions presented as certainty, memories polished into coherence, motives attributed that were never fully yours. All these distortions pass unnoticed because the voice feels inseparable from consciousness. You trust it implicitly, believing it to be a guide, yet it is a filter, a storyteller that prioritizes drama, fear, and repetition over accuracy. Its loyalty is to pattern, not truth. What makes this pitfall so compelling is its invisibility. You rarely question the narrator. You rarely notice its constant framing of your life. When you do, you may feel disoriented, as if the lens shaping your perception has been removed. Choices that seemed obvious become murky. Confidence in memory falters. Even emotions feel manipulated, guided by the invisible commentator whispering its interpretations. And the more you attempt to silence it, the more it asserts itself, looping its judgments and explanations endlessly, reminding you that control belongs to it, not you. Social interactions, too, are colored by this mental narrator. You predict how others will respond based on its scripts. You rehearse conversations and imagine reactions, constructing elaborate scenes inside your mind that feel urgent and real. Often, these rehearsals provoke anxiety, yet the narrator frames them as rational preparation. You believe you are evaluating the situation objectively, but in reality, the commentary amplifies fear and uncertainty. Each thought feels necessary, as if ignoring it could unravel some hidden truth, yet the truths it presents are often fabricated or distorted. The danger deepens because the narrator disguises itself as the self. When you say, "I think" or "I feel," what you actually mean may be, "This is what my internal narrator has constructed for me." Your sense of volition, of independent thought, is subtly overridden by a mental mechanism that constantly interprets and reframes experience. Without realizing it, you become both the observer and the observed, trapped in a dual role where every decision is pre-framed and every memory prejudged. Consciousness becomes a performance rather than presence. Awareness provides the only path out, observing the narrator without merging with it, acknowledging that it comments, judges, and interprets, but is not absolute truth, begins to unravel the illusion. You may still hear its voice, but its dominance fades. The panic, the urgency, the insistence that you follow its scripts These weaken as you recognize that the narrator is a tool, not a ruler. It exists to make sense of the chaos, not to define your reality. Each moment of recognition loosens the invisible chains that bind your mind to its fabricated storylines. Yet even as you gain awareness, the narrator never disappears completely. It lingers, whispering, suggesting, shaping perception in subtle ways. The key is no longer suppression, but conscious observation. When you treat the narrator as an instrument, sometimes helpful, sometimes misleading, you regain agency. The illusion of internal narrator begins to dissolve, replaced by clarity, presence, and the strange liberation of knowing that your consciousness is more than any voice inside your head. You are not merely the story told about you, you are the awareness witnessing the story unfold. If you are following this journey inside your mind, exploring these hidden patterns of thought, consider joining us here on the present path. By subscribing, you ensure that these explorations into consciousness and reality continue, guiding you deeper into the unseen corridors of the mind. Reality, as you perceive it, is often taken for granted. A seamless, continuous experience where cause and effect appear reliable, and events follow a predictable logic. But beneath this apparent stability lies a subtle, almost imperceptible fracture, the fragmented reality slip. It begins not with catastrophe, but with slight dissonances, tiny inconsistencies that your mind brushes aside as coincidence. A clock that reads differently than expected, a conversation remembered differently by someone else, a memory that feels borrowed from another life. These moments are the cracks. Individually, they are harmless, but together, they accumulate, loosening the cohesion of the world you thought you knew. As the slip deepens, the familiar becomes alien. Streets, rooms, faces, even your own body may feel slightly off, as though viewed through a distorted lens. You notice gaps between perception and memory, between expectation and outcome, as if reality itself has begun to skip frames. Everyday experiences, once solid, now feel fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle that never quite fit. Time stretches, compresses, or loops back in subtle ways that defy conventional logic. You begin questioning the reliability of senses you once trusted, wondering if your mind is fabricating parts of the world, or if the world itself has shifted without warning. The pitfall's danger lies in its quiet persistence. Fragmented reality slip does not announce itself with drama. It seeps into consciousness, eroding certainty without demanding attention. You may find yourself rechecking doors you've locked, retracing steps you've taken, or doubting your recollection of entire conversations. Your sense of spatial orientation fluctuates, sometimes suddenly, leaving a momentary dislocation that is both unsettling and ungraspable. You feel present, yet the present seems layered, split, and unreliable. In this state, even familiar rituals, pouring tea, turning a page, walking down a hallway, become exercises in cautious navigation through shifting perceptions. Social interactions compound the distortion. Words spoken by others may seem slightly out of rhythm with your internal expectations. Expressions that once conveyed simple emotions now carry ambiguous meanings, leaving you unsure if understanding is ever possible. Memories shared with friends or family feel misaligned, and attempts to confirm facts only highlight contradictions. Each effort to reconcile fragments reveals more gaps, creating an uncanny sense of alienation. The world is recognizably the same, yet unmistakably different. Fragmentation creates tension between recognition and doubt, familiarity and strangeness. Fragmented reality slip also influences internal thought. Your mind begins compensating for perceived gaps, constructing explanations to bridge discontinuities. These explanations, however, may be partially fabricated, partially accurate, and always provisional. You rely on pattern finding to stabilize experience, but every pattern risks reinforcing illusions. In extreme awareness, you notice that what you called reality is a projection of interpretation layered over fleeting impressions. Observation and belief intertwine, making it difficult to discern where perception ends and imagination begins. Awareness, paradoxically, both exacerbates and relieves the pitfall. The more you scrutinize reality for coherence, the more discrepancies appear. Yet stepping back, accepting that perception is inherently fragmented, grants a strange clarity. You begin to realize that uncertainty is not a flaw, but a fundamental property of consciousness interacting with experience. Fragmentation is not a collapse, it is a lens revealing the mind's role in constructing continuity, showing how perception and interpretation are inseparable from what is observed. Understanding this, you navigate the slip not by seeking complete stability, but by inhabiting the gaps with attentive presence, recognizing the fluid architecture of experience. Fragmented reality, slip reshapes consciousness by challenging assumptions about the world's solidity. It teaches that certainty is often an illusion, and that perception is a delicate interplay of mind and matter. The pitfall is a reminder. Reality is never as fixed as it seems, and the mind that interprets it is never as reliable as it believes. In the fractures, however, lies opportunity, a chance to explore existence beyond habitual expectations, to witness life as a series of ephemeral patterns, and to embrace awareness without attachment to the illusion of seamless continuity. To observe oneself is often considered a sign of awareness, a step toward understanding and growth. Yet within this very act lies a subtle and unsettling trap: the paradox of self-observation. When you watch your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, you create a tension between observer and observed, a duality that can fracture the sense of unity within consciousness. The moment you scrutinize your reactions, you are no longer entirely immersed in experience. Part of you has stepped aside to analyze, judge, and categorize. This split, though seemingly small, magnifies over time, producing a strange sense of detachment. You begin to wonder, am I the one feeling this, or the one watching the feeling arise? The paradox deepens because observation itself changes what is observed. Each act of self-monitoring subtly alters behavior, intention, and thought. You notice a fleeting irritation and immediately moderate it. Yet in doing so, you create a version of yourself that never existed naturally. Spontaneity is replaced by calculation. Emotions, once raw and authentic, now become filtered through an inner lens, evaluated against invisible standards. Over time, this creates a creeping sense of artificiality. The self you experience is increasingly mediated by observation, a reflection of what you believe you should feel, rather than what naturally arises. As the pitfall progresses, consciousness becomes entangled in layers of feedback. You think about your thinking, and then about your thinking about thinking. Each recursive loop amplifies doubt and self-consciousness. Simple decisions, choosing what to say, what to feel, what to do, become laden with scrutiny. The natural flow of experience is disrupted, replaced by an internal performance that never ends. You exist simultaneously as actor and critic, unable to reconcile the two fully. Awareness, intended as a tool for clarity, becomes a cage, restraining the very spontaneity it seeks to illuminate. The danger lies not in observing oneself. It is a necessary aspect of consciousness, but in conflating the observer with the entirety of experience. The mind begins to believe that analysis and judgment are reality, that noticing is equivalent to being. Yet reality, as lived, is always larger than observation. Life happens in the spaces between noticing and experiencing, in moments too subtle for analysis, in the silent flow that eludes measurement. By fixating on the act of self-observation, the observer risks missing the richness of being present, mistaking reflection for reality. Surviving the paradox of self-observation requires a delicate balance. Awareness without domination. You must notice without claiming ownership, witness without controlling, and allow experience to exist without immediate judgment. Thoughts, feelings, and impulses are not enemies. They are phenomena arising within consciousness. By cultivating this perspective, you dissolve the tight grip of observation while retaining insight. You begin to recognize the difference between noticing and defining, between presence and control. Ultimately, the paradox reshapes consciousness by exposing its layered nature. You are never simply an observer or merely observed. You are both, yet neither fully. Identity is fluid, experience is continuous, and awareness is the bridge connecting observer and observed, without demanding their unification. In confronting this subtle trap, you learn to inhabit a space of conscious equilibrium, where observation illuminates without constricting, where self-awareness guides without suffocating, and where the mind is free to witness the unfolding of its own intricate paradoxical dance. Expectation is a quiet force in the mind, shaping perception and guiding behavior. But when expectations become recursive, layered upon themselves endlessly, they create the infinite expectation spiral, a mental pitfall that pulls consciousness into an unrelenting vortex of anticipation and imagined outcomes. It begins subtly, a minor hope, a simple plan, a small projection of the future. Yet once the mind latches onto it, every thought begins to reference it, every action is filtered through it, and each subsequent expectation multiplies, feeding upon the last. Before long, the mind exists almost entirely in the tension between what is anticipated and what is feared, trapped in a spiral that has no natural end. The spiral operates silently, reshaping the perception of time. Each moment becomes a gateway to an imagined consequence, each decision weighed against countless hypothetical outcomes. You may plan for one event, only for your mind to overlay 50 more, each branching into its own cascade of what-ifs. The present fades, reduced to a narrow corridor of preparation, as consciousness becomes consumed with possibilities that will never manifest. The very act of expectation magnifies its own power. Each imagined scenario reinforces the urgency of the next, creating a feedback loop that is nearly impossible to escape. Emotion intensifies the spiral. Anxiety grows as imagined failures loom larger than actual circumstances. Desire strengthens the chain as the mind clings to potential pleasure or success. Even neutral events are distorted, evaluated against a grid of projected outcomes. You may catch glimpses of the absurdity, yet the spiral persists, fueled by the mind's instinct to predict, protect, and prepare. It is not logic but compulsion that drives the cycle, and reason alone is often powerless to interrupt it. Relationships and interactions become subtly warped under the influence of the spiral. You anticipate reactions, rehearse conversations, and assign hidden motives before words are even spoken. The gap between reality and expectation widens, and you experience disappointment, irritation, or elation prematurely, all in response to events that exist only in the mind's projections. The world itself becomes a stage upon which imagined outcomes play endlessly, creating a sense of detachment from what is actually happening. Escaping the infinite expectation spiral requires awareness and patience. The first step is recognizing that expectation is not synonymous with control. Observing the spiral without adding to it, watching how each imagined scenario arises, unfolds, and fades, weakens its grip. By anchoring attention in immediate experience, the mind begins to separate the actual from the projected, reality from its countless simulations. Over time, the spiral loses momentum, revealing that consciousness need not be enslaved by anticipation. Yet the spiral never disappears entirely. Expectation is part of thought itself, inseparable from the mind's natural tendencies. The transformation lies in perspective, recognizing the spiral as a tool rather than a master, using foresight without being consumed, and observing possibilities without becoming trapped. The infinite expectation spiral reshapes consciousness by teaching that freedom emerges not from eliminating thought, but from understanding its patterns, observing without attachment, and inhabiting the present even as the mind wanders into endless futures. Truth is a concept we instinctively pursue, a beacon we trust to guide decisions, actions, and understanding. Yet the mind, in its relentless drive to interpret, categorize, and make sense of experience, often fabricates truths entirely within itself. This is the mind-generated phantom truth, a subtle, insidious mental pitfall where consciousness convinces itself of realities that exist nowhere but in thought. At first, the phenomenon is nearly imperceptible, a fleeting certainty about a memory, a belief about someone's intentions, an assumption about what must happen next. Yet each of these small internal truths solidifies, gains authority, and begins to influence perception, creating a world that feels real, yet is constructed entirely by the mind. The danger of this pitfall lies in its intimate familiarity. Phantom truths feel undeniable. They come dressed in logic, supported by fragments of memory or partial observation, and reinforced by repetition. You may remember an event in a particular way, and unconsciously weave details into a narrative that favors coherence over accuracy. The mind prefers certainty, and it will fill gaps with compelling fabrications to maintain a sense of stability. As a result, you may act, react, or believe in alignment with something that has no external reality, yet the mind treats it as incontrovertible. These internal constructs can dictate choices, amplify anxieties, or foster misconceptions about yourself and others, all while masquerading as absolute truth. Emotional intensity amplifies phantom truths. A moment of jealousy, guilt, or hope can warp perception, convincing you that a hidden reality exists. You feel the conviction as tangible proof, reinforcing the illusion. Even evidence from external sources, words spoken by someone else, fleeting visual cues, subtle expressions can be interpreted in ways that validate the mind's fabrications. Your consciousness, seeking coherence and pattern, becomes a willing accomplice. Over time, the phantom truth embeds itself in neural pathways, appearing as habitually accepted fact. The longer it persists, the harder it is to disentangle from actual reality, making awareness and discernment increasingly elusive. The ripple effect extends into relationships. Misunderstandings emerge not from others' actions, but from the phantom truths generated within your mind. You may sense betrayal where none exists, perceive criticism that was never offered, or interpret casual remarks as hidden judgments. Communication becomes filtered through the lens of internally constructed realities, making interactions simultaneously vivid and unreliable. You trust your perceptions because they feel coherent and complete, yet the coherence is an internal artifact, a self-generated story with consequences as real as the world itself. Memory, too, is distorted by this pitfall. Each recollection is influenced by internal narratives, shaping how events are remembered and interpreted. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. The mind recalls experiences in ways that reinforce phantom truths, which in turn influence future perception and behavior. The process is subtle. You rarely notice the manipulation because it occurs from within, as if consciousness itself is narrating reality with a hidden bias. What you consider fact becomes intertwined with interpretation, imagination, and expectation, leaving you in a liminal space where truth is indistinguishable from fabrication. Breaking free from the mind-generated phantom truth requires deliberate observation. Awareness alone is not enough. One must actively examine beliefs and perceptions, tracing them back to their origin. Ask yourself, is this experience verified by direct observation, or is it a narrative my mind constructed? The process is uncomfortable. It exposes cognitive habits, emotional biases, and the mind's tendency to prioritize coherence over accuracy. Yet each act of discernment weakens the grip of phantom truths, revealing a landscape of consciousness that is simultaneously vibrant and malleable. Paradoxically, the pitfall also illuminates the power of consciousness. The mind's ability to generate truths demonstrates creativity and pattern recognition, abilities that enable complex understanding, problem-solving, and imaginative insight. The challenge lies not in eliminating this function, but in recognizing its limits and distinguishing between internally generated constructs and external reality. In learning this distinction, awareness shifts from passive acceptance to active engagement, enabling consciousness to navigate a world that is both real and partially self-created. As the pitfall deepens, one experiences a subtle, existential unease. Actions may be questioned retrospectively. Did I respond to reality or to my internal version of it? Interactions with others may feel mediated, distorted by beliefs and assumptions invisible to all but your own mind. Even moments of clarity are tempered by awareness of the mind's capacity to fabricate. Yet this unease, while unsettling, is also instructive. It teaches humility, reminding you that certainty is rarely absolute and that perception is always filtered through the machinery of consciousness. Ultimately, the mind-generated phantom truth reshapes consciousness by revealing the delicate interplay between perception, memory, emotion, and belief. You are reminded that awareness is not synonymous with truth, and that reality is often co-authored by mind and environment. Freedom arises not from eradicating internal constructs but from recognizing them, observing their influence, and choosing how to respond. Each phantom truth that is exposed, questioned, and understood loosens the grip of automatic interpretation, allowing consciousness to navigate existence with clarity, flexibility, and a profound sense of presence. Even as awareness grows, phantom truths continue to emerge. They are part of the mind's nature, a mechanism designed to impose order upon uncertainty. Yet with deliberate observation, they no longer hold dominion over perception. You witness them as phenomena rather than commands, acknowledging their existence while refusing to let them dictate reality. In this delicate balance, the mind finds both freedom and insight, revealing that truth is not a static endpoint, but a living, dynamic process shaped by observation, discernment, and conscious engagement. Memory is often trusted as a faithful record of past events, a repository of experience that shapes identity, decisions, and expectations. Yet memory is not a static archive. It is a living, reconstructive process, prone to distortion, amplification, and selective emphasis. The distorted memory echo is a mental pitfall where past experiences reverberate through consciousness, warped by interpretation, emotion, and repetition, until they no longer resemble the original events. What you remember feels vivid, authoritative, undeniable, but closer inspection reveals that the recollection is filtered, colored, and often exaggerated. Each echo reinforces itself, embedding subtly within perception and influencing both present behavior and future expectations. The process begins quietly. A minor event is recalled, perhaps a conversation, a gesture, or a fleeting glance. Emotion is intertwined with perception, assigning significance or threat where none objectively existed. The memory is replayed mentally, reconstructed with narrative embellishments, gaps filled with assumptions, and consequences magnified. The more the memory is revisited, the more it diverges from reality, transforming into a distorted echo that the mind treats as factual. Soon, what once was a simple occurrence now carries the weight of profound importance, shaping decisions and coloring perception of the present. These echoes often interact with self-perception. You may judge yourself based on reconstructed failures, relive imagined slights, or reinterpret successes as luck rather than merit. The distortion amplifies emotional response, creating an internal climate of anxiety, guilt, or pride that may not correspond to actual events. Each recollection reinforces identity narratives, even when the narrative is flawed. In this way, the past becomes an active force in the present, not because it accurately reflects history, but because consciousness has woven it into a compelling, internally consistent story. Social relationships are equally affected. Conversations, interactions, and shared experiences are remembered differently by each participant. A harmless comment may be recollected as criticism, a fleeting glance as disapproval, or a joke as ridicule. These distortions, reinforced over time, influence trust, perception, and behavior, often leading to misunderstandings or self-fulfilling prophecies. The mind is adept at integrating partial truths into a coherent framework, yet coherence does not equal accuracy. The echoes persist, magnifying minor discrepancies and creating an internal world that is both familiar and subtly alien. Emotion and expectation exacerbate the pitfall. Anxiety amplifies threatening echoes, nostalgia idealizes positive memories, and unresolved experiences create loops of repetitive recall. You may find yourself mentally returning to events repeatedly, attempting to understand, correct, or resolve them. Yet each repetition further distorts the memory, intensifying its emotional charge and embedding it more firmly into consciousness. The very act of remembering becomes part of the distortion, a recursive feedback loop that challenges the notion of objective recollection. Breaking free from distorted memory. Echo requires deliberate awareness. Observing memories as phenomena, rather than definitive truths, allows you to recognize the divergence between recollection and reality. A single memory is no longer accepted at face value. It becomes a story to be examined, understood, and contextualized. This perspective does not erase the memory or diminish its impact, but it separates lived reality from mental reconstruction, weakening the emotional grip that distorted echoes can impose. The pitfall also teaches the mind about impermanence and fluidity. Just as thoughts arise and fade, memories are dynamic, shaped by context, mood, and attention. By witnessing the echoes without becoming entangled, consciousness learns that the past is a living, interpretive space rather than a fixed record. Awareness transforms memory from a source of unchallenged authority into a tool for reflection, growth, and understanding. Yet awareness alone is not a cure. Distorted echoes will continue to emerge. They are an inherent function of a mind that reconstructs experience. The challenge is to observe without automatic belief, to differentiate perception from reality, and to resist the urge to act as if the reconstructed past dictates the present. In this delicate equilibrium, consciousness gains resilience, clarity, and insight. Ultimately, the distorted memory echo reshapes consciousness by revealing the interpretive nature of recollection. It challenges the assumption that memories are accurate records, exposing how thought, emotion, and expectation intertwine to create a personalized, often misleading version of reality. By confronting this pitfall, you learn to inhabit the present with awareness, acknowledging the past without being bound to it, and recognizing that the mind's reconstructions, however compelling, are not absolute truth, but reflections shaped by perception, desire, and imagination. Within the architecture of consciousness lies a network of assumptions, convictions, and unexamined beliefs that silently govern perception, thought, and action. Most of these beliefs operate beneath awareness, invisible yet powerful, shaping the way reality is interpreted and experienced. The hidden belief maze is a mental pitfall where these unconscious convictions create intricate pathways that trap the mind in self-reinforcing patterns. You may think you are responding to the world objectively, but in truth, your actions and interpretations follow hidden guides whose origins you may never fully recognize. At first, the maze is imperceptible. It manifests as subtle biases, recurring thought patterns, or automatic emotional reactions. You notice them only when you stumble, when a contradiction arises, an expectation fails, or a decision produces unexpected discomfort. Each hidden belief functions like a silent architect. It determines what is possible, what is dangerous, and what is worthy of attention. You move through life assuming transparency, unaware that your choices, fears, and judgments are channeled along invisible corridors. When a thought aligns with a hidden belief, it feels natural, inevitable, and correct. When it conflicts, the mind resists, producing confusion, denial, or rationalization. In this way, consciousness navigates not the open expanse of reality, but a complex maze constructed from prior assumptions, cultural conditioning, personal experiences, and emotional habits. The pathways of the maze are reinforced each time you act without questioning underlying premises. Over time, these roots harden, creating patterns that feel like self-evident truth, yet they are often distortions, partial perspectives, or inherited narratives that no longer serve genuine understanding. The maze grows more intricate when beliefs interact, overlap, or contradict one another. One hidden conviction may affirm a second, which invalidates a third, producing loops and dead ends within the mental architecture. You may find yourself wrestling with internal contradictions, feeling torn between instinctive responses and rational thought. The effort to reconcile inconsistencies can consume attention and energy, producing mental fatigue and anxiety. Yet even as the maze traps and confuses, it simultaneously sustains a sense of coherence. Without these hidden guides, perception and thought would be chaotic. The paradox is that the very beliefs that limit freedom also create the illusion of order and stability, a structure in which consciousness can navigate the world, albeit imperfectly. Emotions amplify the labyrinth. Fear reinforces beliefs that prioritize safety over exploration. Desire strengthens convictions that promise reward or validation. Shame and guilt anchor judgments about self and others, creating invisible walls that restrict behavior. You respond to cues in your environment, not solely on fact, but through the lens of the maze, interpreting events in ways that reinforce existing pathways. Each confirmation strengthens the underlying beliefs, making the maze more elaborate, more convincing, and harder to navigate. At times, it may feel as though there is no exit, only an endless network of routes that seem correct, yet produce discomfort or confusion when pursued. Awareness offers the only path toward illumination. Observing beliefs as mental constructs, rather than unquestionable truth, allows consciousness to identify the patterns, the loops, and the contradictions embedded within the maze. This process requires honesty and patience. One must trace each reaction, each thought, and each emotion back to its source, questioning why it arises and whether it reflects objective reality or a hidden premise. In doing so, the invisible corridors of the maze are exposed, revealing alternative pathways that had been obscured by assumption. Recognition does not eliminate beliefs, but it transforms them from unconscious constraints into conscious tools, enabling deliberate navigation rather than automatic obedience. The hidden belief maze also reveals the interplay between self and society. Many hidden convictions originate from external sources, cultural norms, parental influence, social expectation. These inherited patterns are deeply embedded, yet rarely examined. As awareness grows, consciousness begins to distinguish between internally generated beliefs and externally imposed narratives. This distinction provides a subtle liberation, the realization that some limitations are not inherent to the self, but imposed and sustained by unexamined acceptance. By identifying these influences, you reclaim agency, navigating the maze consciously, rather than being led blindly along invisible paths. Yet complete liberation from the maze is impossible. Beliefs are an intrinsic part of mind, and some level of assumption is necessary for functioning. The goal is not erasure but discernment. By acknowledging the existence of hidden beliefs and observing their influence, consciousness gains clarity and flexibility. Patterns that once constrained become optional routes, insights rather than imperatives. The maze, once a trap, becomes a map, a structure to explore, understand, and navigate with intention. Ultimately, the hidden belief maze reshapes consciousness by exposing the unseen frameworks that guide thought, perception, and behavior. It teaches that reality is never perceived in isolation, but always through a network of internalized assumptions, many invisible to the conscious mind. By observing, questioning, and tracing these patterns, one gains the capacity to move through life with greater awareness, choosing paths deliberately rather than following them unconsciously. In this intricate balance, the mind learns both humility and mastery. Humility in recognizing its hidden constraints, and mastery in navigating the labyrinth with intention, clarity, and presence. Awareness is often praised as the gateway to clarity, self-understanding, and mental freedom. Yet in certain circumstances, the very act of noticing can exacerbate the problem it seeks to resolve. This is the awareness backfire effect, a subtle, paradoxical mental pitfall where increased attention magnifies rather than diminishes the intensity of thoughts, emotions, or behavioral patterns. It begins innocuously. You observe a recurring fear, a habitual impulse, or a negative thought pattern, believing that recognition alone will weaken its power. Instead, the act of observation feeds the phenomenon, amplifying its prominence and drawing more energy into it than ever before. Awareness, intended as a tool for liberation, becomes a mirror, reflecting the very thing you hope to diminish. The mechanism is deceptively simple. Consciousness naturally lends weight to what it observes. By turning attention to a particular thought or feeling, you inadvertently assign it significance. Each observation activates neural pathways, reinforcing the very patterns you intend to diminish. A fleeting anxiety that once passed unnoticed may now persist, looping insistently in response to scrutiny. A minor compulsion becomes increasingly compelling. Even neutral experiences acquire layers of interpretation, filtered through heightened vigilance. The mind, believing it is protecting or correcting, invests attention, energy, and intention, creating a self-perpetuating cycle that mirrors the object of observation back upon itself, stronger than before. Emotion intensifies the backfire. Observed anxieties, doubts, or impulses generate subtle arousal that reinforces the pattern. The more you notice, the more your body and mind react, creating a feedback loop of attention and response. Your rational mind may attempt to analyze the pattern, separating observation from reaction, yet analysis itself becomes part of the cycle, producing a recursive loop of awareness and amplification. Awareness, rather than dissolving the phenomenon, becomes entangled with it, feeding its persistence. The pitfall also interacts with expectation. You anticipate that observing a thought or behavior will produce insight or relief. When this fails, or produces the opposite result, you experience frustration, self-criticism, or doubt. These reactions, in turn, become additional phenomena to observe, layering new loops atop old ones. Consciousness, now engaged in a complex network of noticing, reacting, and evaluating, becomes both stage and audience. You exist simultaneously as observer, participant, and analyst, entangled in an intricate cycle that obscures clarity rather than producing it. Relationships and social interactions further amplify the effect. Observing one's own reactions to others can heighten self-consciousness, producing overcorrections, hesitation, or misinterpretations. You may catch yourself analyzing every word, gesture, or glance, not for understanding, but to prevent imagined errors. Each act of observation increases attention and reinforces tension, subtly warping perception and interaction. Even intentions that are sincere are filtered through heightened awareness, producing distortion, hesitation, or anxiety. Breaking free from the awareness backfire effect requires paradoxical subtlety. Instead of clinging to observation as a corrective tool, one must adopt a stance of gentle witnessing, where attention is present but not forceful. Rather than scrutinizing or analyzing, awareness becomes an open, non-judgmental field in which thoughts, feelings, and impulses arise and pass. The key lies in separating attention from compulsion, to notice without acting, to acknowledge without intervening. In this subtle shift, the mind begins to release the loops strengthened by intense observation, allowing phenomena to dissipate naturally, rather than being magnified by scrutiny. The pitfall also illustrates the dynamic nature of consciousness. The same mental faculty, attention, that can cultivate insight, focus, and understanding, can, if misapplied, reinforce patterns of suffering or entrapment. Awareness is a tool, not an automatic solution. Its application requires discernment, patience, and balance. Conscious engagement with thought and emotion must be paired with acceptance, not control, and with observation, not judgment. Ultimately, the awareness backfire effect reshapes consciousness by revealing the delicate balance between noticing and amplifying. It teaches that presence alone is insufficient. The quality of attention determines whether awareness liberates or ensnares. By cultivating gentle, non-judgmental observation, consciousness learns to witness phenomena without feeding them, dissolving cycles of reinforcement and creating space for clarity, choice, and serenity. Awareness is no longer a weapon against the mind, nor a conduit for its traps. It becomes a landscape in which thought, emotion, and impulse coexist without domination, revealing the subtle, intricate architecture of conscious experience. Desire is one of the most persistent drivers of consciousness, shaping decisions, guiding attention, and fueling motivation. Yet unchecked, desire can create its own mental trap, the echo chamber of desire. This pitfall occurs when thoughts, cravings, and yearnings loop within the mind, amplifying themselves and creating a self-reinforcing feedback system. Initially, it is subtle, a wish for success, approval, or pleasure. Yet, as consciousness repeatedly cycles through the longing, the desire grows more urgent, more insistent, and increasingly divorced from immediate reality. The mind begins to interpret every external signal as a confirmation or challenge to the desire, amplifying both anticipation and frustration. The echo chamber operates silently. Each thought or feeling related to desire triggers another, creating a recursive chain in which longing consumes attention. You may notice your focus narrowing, repeatedly returning to the object of desire, replaying fantasies, or imagining outcomes in intricate detail. Time stretches and contracts around these loops, with consciousness caught between the present moment and the imagined satisfaction of fulfillment. Even minor stimuli, an image, a phrase, a passing comment, can reignite the cycle, deepening its grip. The desire is no longer merely an inclination. It becomes a self-perpetuating mental reality, demanding attention and shaping perception in subtle, persistent ways. Emotion magnifies the effect. Anticipation produces pleasure and tension simultaneously, while disappointment or delay generates frustration and anxiety. The more the mind dwells on the desire, the more neural pathways are reinforced, embedding the pattern into habitual thought. The echo chamber thrives because consciousness is compelled to follow familiar loops, even when doing so produces discomfort or prevents engagement with the actual present. You may act, react, and interpret events not based on reality, but through the filter of accumulated longing, creating a mental environment that both feeds and is fed by desire. Relationships and social interactions are also influenced. Conversations, gestures, and expressions are interpreted in terms of how they relate to your desire. People, events, and opportunities are filtered, evaluated, or misperceived through the lens of the echo chamber. Even successes or affirmations may intensify the loop rather than satisfy it, because the desire has become autonomous, independent of external validation. The mind begins to crave the reinforcement itself, not the original object, creating layers of expectation and tension that continuously recycle attention back into the chamber. The danger of the echo chamber of desire lies in its subtlety. At first, it may appear motivating or harmless, even enjoyable, yet over time, it constrains consciousness, narrowing attention, reducing flexibility, and producing cycles of craving and dissatisfaction. Awareness alone is insufficient. If it is directed toward fulfilling desire, without deliberate intervention, the echo chamber will perpetuate itself, a closed system that operates independent of logic, need, or circumstance. Escaping this pitfall requires recognition and detachment. Awareness must shift from immersion to observation, seeing desire as a phenomenon rather than a directive. The mind learns to notice the rise and fall of craving without attaching significance or urgency, to observe anticipation without acting compulsively, and to distinguish between longing and actual necessity. Through this stance, the recursive loops weaken, attention broadens, and consciousness regains flexibility. Desire is neither eradicated nor suppressed. It is reframed as one aspect of experience rather than a controlling force. Paradoxically, the echo chamber also illuminates the mind's capacity for creation and imagination. Desire demonstrates the mind's ability to envision, anticipate, and simulate outcomes, allowing exploration of possibilities beyond immediate circumstance. The challenge is not the existence of desire itself, but the inability to disengage from the loop it creates. By cultivating observational awareness, consciousness navigates desire without being trapped, retaining the energy of motivation while avoiding the mental confinement of obsession. Ultimately, the echo chamber of desire reshapes consciousness by revealing the mind's tendency to amplify and recycle patterns. It teaches that attention is a powerful force, capable of either ensnaring or liberating, and that desire is a tool best engaged with clarity and perspective. When observed without attachment, the echo chamber loses its dominion, allowing the mind to experience longing without being consumed by it. Consciousness, freed from repetitive loops, regains agency, balance, and presence, navigating the interplay of want and fulfillment with insight and equanimity. Consciousness thrives on decision-making, yet the very freedom to choose can become a source of entrapment. The paralyzed choice trap occurs when the abundance of options overwhelms the mind, producing hesitation, anxiety, and indecision. At first, it manifests subtly, a minor uncertainty about what to eat, where, or do. But as options multiply, some real, some imagined, the mental process becomes recursive, with each choice requiring evaluation against countless hypothetical outcomes. The mind begins to stall, caught between desire, fear, and expectation, unable to commit to any course of action without simultaneously considering the consequences of all others. The trap operates through overanalysis. Every potential decision is scrutinized, weighed, and compared. Consciousness attempts to calculate the optimal choice, yet no calculation can account for every variable, every unforeseen ripple in time, or every internal emotional reaction. This produces a feedback loop. The more you analyze, the more uncertainty emerges, and the more uncertainty emerges, the more analysis is required. Even small, seemingly inconsequential decisions can feel monumental because the mind interprets each choice as a point of critical significance in the unfolding of reality. Emotion intensifies the paralysis. Anxiety amplifies perceived risks, creating exaggerated scenarios of failure, regret, or loss. Desire amplifies perceived benefits, making non-action feel like an opportunity missed. Fear of error, judgment, or consequences magnifies each choice, producing hesitation and self-doubt. Over time, repeated cycles of indecision reinforce neural pathways associated with avoidance, creating habitual patterns in which consciousness defaults to inaction rather than engagement. The trap is self-reinforcing. The more one experiences hesitation, the stronger the anticipation of paralysis becomes in future situations. Social and relational dynamics deepen the effect. Choices involving others, collaboration, communication, or shared planning introduce additional variables. Anticipated reactions, social expectations, and imagined judgments magnify uncertainty. You may find yourself over-preparing, second-guessing every step, or endlessly consulting others for validation. Yet even input from outside sources cannot fully resolve the mental stalemate. Relationships, rather than providing clarity, become arenas where indecision and internal conflict are mirrored, intensifying the trap. Breaking free requires a combination of awareness and action. Consciousness must first recognize the recursive patterns, observing hesitation and over-analysis without judgment. Then, deliberate movement through the paralysis is necessary. Small, intentional choices taken despite uncertainty. Each act of decision-making, however minor, reinforces neural patterns of agency and disrupts the loop of indecision. Over time, awareness transforms the trap from a paralyzing feedback loop into a field of measured engagement, where choices are approached with clarity and adaptability rather than fear and fixation. The pitfall also exposes the paradoxical relationship between freedom and constraint. The mind desires autonomy and agency, yet the very abundance of potential paths can become a constraint in itself. Paradoxically, the solution lies not in limiting options externally, but in cultivating internal discernment, the ability to navigate multiplicity without being overwhelmed. Consciousness learns that freedom does not guarantee ease, but with observation and intentionality, indecision can be transformed into empowered choice. Ultimately, the paralyzed choice trap reshapes consciousness by revealing the subtle tension between freedom and agency. It demonstrates how attention, anticipation, and fear interact to influence decision-making, and how the mind can imprison itself in the very processes designed to promote autonomy. Through mindful observation and deliberate action, consciousness learns to move within complexity without succumbing to paralysis, finding balance between analysis and action, reflection and engagement. In this balance, freedom is reclaimed, not as a mere possibility, but as a lived experience, grounded in awareness, presence, and the courage to choose. The mind possesses a remarkable ability to anticipate, predict, and project. Yet this capability can paradoxically ensnare consciousness in the self-fulfilling prophecy loop, a mental pitfall in which beliefs and expectations about the future actively shape the outcomes they anticipate. It begins subtly, a thought about potential failure, rejection, or success. The mind latches onto the scenario, interpreting events through the lens of expectation, influencing decisions, actions, and reactions in ways that make the anticipated outcome more likely to occur. What started as a mental projection becomes reality, not through fate or inevitability, but because consciousness actively participates in manifesting it. The loop operates through attention and interpretation. Consciousness filters information to confirm the anticipated outcome, selectively noticing events, gestures, and words that align with expectation, while ignoring contradictory evidence. Subtle behaviors, such as hesitation, overcompensation, or guarded responses, are unconsciously enacted, reinforcing the scenario. Others interact with these behaviors, responding in ways that align with the prophecy, unaware of the internal forces shaping their engagement. Over time, the expected outcome seems inevitable, not because it was predetermined, but because the mind orchestrated it through perception, thought, and action. Emotion amplifies the effect. Anxiety about failure, desire for approval, or fear of loss intensifies focus on the expected outcome, increasing vigilance, interpretation, and reaction. Positive expectations can similarly produce loops of reinforcement, as confidence guides action in ways that align with success. Yet even beneficial prophecies distort perception, causing overemphasis on confirming evidence while minimizing alternative possibilities. Consciousness, caught in the loop, becomes both actor and observer, witnessing the unfolding of events through a lens biased by its own anticipatory narrative. Social dynamics magnify the loop. In interactions, expectations influence tone, expression, and behavior, subtly shaping the responses of others. If you anticipate rejection, you may unconsciously project insecurity or distance, eliciting responses that confirm your belief. If you expect approval, confidence and warmth may draw positive engagement. The mind perceives reality as aligning with expectation, yet it has orchestrated this alignment through the very beliefs it holds. The loop is recursive, self-reinforcing, and often invisible until its consequences manifest clearly, producing both astonishment and disorientation. Breaking free from the self-fulfilling prophecy loop requires conscious recognition of expectations' influence. Awareness must extend to the subtle ways thought and belief shape behavior, attention, and interpretation. By observing the emergence of anticipatory patterns without automatically enacting them, consciousness disrupts the recursive cycle, Small interventions, pausing before reacting, questioning assumptions, seeking alternative perspectives, begin to loosen the loop, allowing responses to align with present reality rather than projected outcomes. The pitfall also illuminates the power and responsibility inherent in consciousness. The mind's ability to shape experience demonstrates creativity, influence, and subtle causality, yet these capacities are double-edged. Expectation can guide, inspire, and motivate, but unchecked it becomes a trap, producing outcomes that reinforce illusion. Recognizing this duality is essential for navigating the loop consciously, using expectation as a tool rather than surrendering to it as a directive. Ultimately, the self-fulfilling prophecy loop reshapes consciousness by highlighting the interplay between belief, perception, and reality. It teaches that anticipation is not neutral. Thoughts are active agents in shaping experience. Through awareness, observation, and deliberate action, consciousness gains the capacity to break free from recursive expectation, transforming the loop from a trap into a domain of insight and choice. Reality is no longer a passive stage but a collaborative arena, shaped in part by the mind that observes, interprets, and participates within it. Freedom emerges as the ability to anticipate without being confined, to project without being ensnared, and to inhabit the present without being dictated by imagined futures. Within the mind, conflicting beliefs, values, or experiences can collide, producing tension, discomfort, and uncertainty. This collision is not merely a momentary imbalance. When unresolved, it deepens into the cognitive dissonance abyss, a mental pitfall in which contradictory elements of thought pull consciousness in opposing directions, creating a sense of internal fragmentation. At first, dissonance is subtle, a minor conflict between what you think you should do and what you actually do, between what you believe and what you feel. Yet, as these contradictions accumulate, the mind becomes strained, attempting to reconcile irreconcilable elements, often by constructing rationalizations, suppressing awareness, or distorting perception. The abyss operates through the mind's desire for coherence. Consciousness instinctively seeks harmony among beliefs, actions, and emotions. When contradictions emerge, the mind experiences discomfort and urgency to restore balance. This leads to compensatory strategies, selective attention, biased interpretation, or avoidance of conflicting information. A fleeting ethical conflict may be reinterpreted as acceptable, a failure reframed as temporary, or a dissonant thought pushed out of awareness. Over time, these strategies mask the underlying tension without resolving it, embedding it deeper in the subconscious and perpetuating the abyss. Emotion intensifies the effect. Guilt, anxiety, or shame heightens the perceived severity of contradictions. While desire and attachment distort interpretation, the mind oscillates between justification and suppression, producing cycles of internal debate that feel endless and exhausting. Even minor conflicts can trigger disproportionate emotional responses, as the cognitive machinery labors to maintain the illusion of coherence. The abyss is amplified when contradictions involve identity, morality, or deeply held values, creating persistent tension that subtly shapes thought, perception, and behavior. Social interactions further complicate the pitfall. External expectations, cultural norms, and interpersonal feedback can conflict with internal beliefs, magnifying dissonance. You may act in ways that align with social roles while privately feeling inconsistency or disagreement, producing a double layer of tension, one internal, one relational. Attempts to reconcile these layers may generate further rationalization or denial, strengthening the abyss rather than resolving it. Awareness of these dynamics often heightens discomfort, as the mind recognizes its own entrapment, yet struggles to find a coherent path forward. Breaking free from the cognitive dissonance abyss requires acknowledgement and acceptance. Awareness alone is insufficient. One must consciously confront contradictions, rather than masking or rationalizing them. This involves observing conflicting beliefs and emotions without immediate resolution, creating mental space in which tension can exist without producing reactive distortion. Consciousness begins to perceive dissonance not as failure, but as an intrinsic feature of complex thought and experience, revealing opportunities for reflection, adaptation, and insight. The pitfall also illustrates the mind's capacity for self-deception and self-correction. Cognitive dissonance is simultaneously a source of discomfort and a mechanism for growth. The abyss exposes assumptions, habitual judgments, and internalized contradictions, offering the possibility of deliberate reevaluation. Through patient observation, one can identify which beliefs are aligned with truth and which are artifacts of habit, expectation, or external influence. This process does not eliminate tension entirely, but transforms it into a guide, a tool for conscious refinement of thought and action. Ultimately, the cognitive dissonance abyss reshapes consciousness by revealing the fragility and plasticity of internal coherence. It teaches that mental discomfort is not inherently negative. It signals areas where perception, belief, and reality intersect imperfectly. By embracing dissonance as a space for observation, reflection, and choice, consciousness develops resilience, adaptability, and discernment. The abyss becomes a landscape in which thought and emotion are explored rather than feared, in which contradictions are navigated rather than suppressed, and in which awareness transforms conflict into insight, guiding the mind toward greater clarity, integration, and freedom. Control is an instinctive desire of consciousness. The belief that one can influence events, outcomes, or even the behavior of others. Yet this desire often ensnares the mind in the illusion of control web, a mental pitfall where perceived influence is overestimated, creating intricate patterns of thought and behavior that give a false sense of mastery. At first, the web is subtle, a belief that careful planning, vigilance, or persuasion can ensure a desired outcome. Over time, however, the mind invests increasing attention and energy into controlling what is inherently uncertain, producing tension, frustration, and repeated disappointment. The web grows stronger the more one tries to assert influence, entrapping consciousness in a cycle of expectation and struggle. The mechanism operates through selective perception. Events that appear to respond to your actions reinforce the illusion, even when coincidence or external factors are responsible. Minor successes are overinterpreted as proof of influence, while failures are rationalized or externalized. Attention focuses on patterns that validate control, while contradictory evidence is ignored. The mind constructs a narrative in which it is central, capable, and responsible for shaping outcomes, creating a self-reinforcing loop that strengthens the web. Each observed correlation between effort and result feels like mastery, even if causality is tenuous or non-existent. Emotion intensifies the trap. Anxiety, fear, and desire drive heightened monitoring and intervention, while satisfaction and pride reward the mind for perceived control. The more intense the investment, the more intricate the web becomes. Consciousness may spend hours planning, predicting, or persuading, believing it can prevent adverse outcomes or guarantee success. Yet the inherent unpredictability of reality ensures that complete control is impossible. The effort to manage, guide, or direct outcomes paradoxically strengthens the attachment to control, reinforcing the web and deepening entanglement. Social interactions further complicate the pitfall. Attempting to influence others through persuasion, subtle manipulation, or expectation feeds the illusion. You may misinterpret compliance, agreement, or silence as evidence of effectiveness, overlooking independent choice, randomness, or external circumstances. Relationships become subtly strained as the desire for control conflicts with the autonomy of others. Each effort to assert mastery reinforces the mind's pattern of vigilance, adjustment, and evaluation, making it increasingly difficult to discern genuine influence from perceived authority. Breaking free from the illusion of control. Web requires acceptance of uncertainty. Awareness must extend to the subtle ways the mind interprets outcomes as dependent on its actions. Observing attempts at influence without attachment allows consciousness to recognize the distinction between effort and result. Small experiments in letting go, releasing the need for specific outcomes, observing events unfold without intervention, and embracing unpredictability begin to weaken the web. The mind learns that influence exists within boundaries, and that true agency emerges not from domination, but from adaptive engagement. The pitfall also illustrates the duality of consciousness, the capacity to act and the tendency to overestimate its power. The mind's skill in planning, predicting, and influencing is genuine, yet its interpretation often exceeds reality. The challenge lies in calibrating perception, acknowledging competence without succumbing to illusion, exercising choice without mistaking it for omnipotence, and navigating uncertainty without rigid attachment to outcomes. Consciousness learns that control is partial, perception is selective, and effort does not always dictate result. Ultimately, the illusion of control web reshapes consciousness by exposing the tension between agency and uncertainty. It teaches that perceived mastery is often a construct of attention, pattern recognition, and expectation, rather than a reflection of objective influence. By observing, releasing attachment, and embracing unpredictability, consciousness disentangles from the web, finding freedom in acceptance and flexibility. The mind discovers a paradoxical clarity. True empowerment does not arise from forcing outcomes, but from understanding limits, engaging intentionally, and participating in the unfolding of reality without illusion. Time is the invisible thread that weaves consciousness together, yet it is not experienced uniformly. The mind interprets, accelerates, and slows time, creating the mental pitfall known as time perception distortion. In this state, the passage of moments is warped by attention, expectation, emotion, or repetitive thought. A single hour can stretch endlessly during anxiety, shrink under distraction, or feel cyclical when memories and anticipations overlap. Consciousness, expecting linearity, becomes ensnared in a fluid temporal landscape where the past, present, and future interlace unpredictably, producing subtle disorientation and tension. The distortion begins subtly, often unnoticed, waiting for an event, anticipating outcomes, or ruminating on experiences compresses and expands perception. The mind fills gaps with imagined scenarios, loops memories into the present, or projects future possibilities, creating temporal anomalies that feel immediate and real. A minor delay can seem infinite, a fleeting joy, ephemeral. Each instance reinforces the brain's habit of constructing subjective time, tethering consciousness to an internal rhythm rather than objective passage. Over time, these distortions reshape how one experiences reality, as the mind interprets moments through the lens of attention and expectation rather than external chronology. Emotion intensifies temporal distortion. Anxiety elongates moments of discomfort, producing a sense of suspended anticipation. Nostalgia contracts perceived duration, as memory condenses experience into essence rather than chronology. Desire, anticipation, or fear amplifies focus on particular temporal points, causing them to dominate consciousness. Even neutral experiences are colored by internal interpretation, stretching or shrinking perception without notice. The mind learns to navigate reality based on subjective rhythm, often mistaking it for objective flow, deepening the distortion. Memory also interacts with this pitfall. Recollections of the past are often compressed, expanded, or reordered, affecting present perception of time. Events experienced as fleeting may later feel prolonged, while lengthy experiences may be recalled as brief. Expectations of the future can similarly warp temporal judgment, as imagined possibilities dominate attention. Consciousness becomes a dynamic field where past, present, and anticipated future intersect, creating loops and overlays that challenge linear perception. Social and environmental factors further complicate the distortion. In high-stimulation environments, time may feel accelerated. In monotony, it may drag. Coordination with others' expectations or schedules can conflict with internal temporal perception, creating tension or dissonance. You may perceive delays as excessive, responses as sluggish, or interactions as fleeting, all due to the mind's inherent subjectivity in processing duration. The interplay between external reality and internal experience produces subtle dissonance, further shaping consciousness's sense of continuity and sequence. Breaking free from time perception distortion involves cultivating anchored awareness. Mindfulness and presence allow consciousness to inhabit the moment without excessive projection or rumination. Observing the mind's natural tendencies to distort duration without judgment or resistance diminishes their influence. Temporal awareness shifts from being driven by expectation or emotional modulation to being guided by direct sensory experience, anchoring perception in what is rather than what is anticipated or remembered. The pitfall also highlights the mind's creative power. Subjective time enables imagination, planning, and reflection, revealing consciousness's capacity to manipulate experience internally. Yet this power comes with the risk of entanglement. Moments can feel unending, fleeting, or recursive, producing subtle anxiety, frustration, or detachment. The challenge is not to eliminate temporal fluidity, but to observe and navigate it consciously, using the mind's capacity without being dominated by it. Ultimately, time perception distortion reshapes consciousness by demonstrating the elasticity of subjective experience. It reveals that time is not merely measured externally, but continuously interpreted and reconstructed internally. By cultivating awareness, observing distortions without attachment, and grounding perception in immediate experience, consciousness learns to inhabit moments fully, navigating temporal fluidity with presence and clarity. Time becomes not a source of tension, but a landscape of experience, dynamically shaped by attention, awareness, and the intricate interplay between mind and reality. Human consciousness is deeply attuned to social connection and approval, yet this instinct can become a trap. The illusory social validation pitfall occurs when the mind places disproportionate weight on perceived acceptance, recognition, or approval from others, constructing an internal reality where external validation dictates self-worth. At first, it is subtle, a fleeting concern about appearance, a minor sensitivity to comment, or a slight preoccupation with praise. Over time, however, these mental patterns entrench themselves, creating a feedback loop in which consciousness constantly monitors, interprets, and reacts to social signals, often inflating their significance or misinterpreting intent. The mechanism is deceptively simple. Attention filters social interactions through the lens of validation. Gestures, expressions, words, and silences are amplified or minimized depending on the mind's expectations. A neutral remark may be construed as criticism, a polite acknowledgement as praise, a casual glance as judgment. The mind constructs a narrative in which self-worth is contingent upon external confirmation. Each perceived endorsement reinforces the belief, while each perceived slight strengthens internal doubt. Consciousness becomes a stage on which social feedback continuously scripts the experience of self, subtly dictating emotions, reactions, and priorities. Emotion intensifies the trap. Desire for approval produces anxiety, anticipation, or vigilance, magnifying attention to subtle cues. Fear of rejection or disapproval triggers defensive strategies, overcompensation, or avoidance. Even positive social reinforcement may heighten sensitivity, producing a paradoxical loop where approval becomes both craved and scrutinized. Over time, the mind learns to regulate behavior and thought, primarily in response to perceived social signals, prioritizing conformity and acceptance over authenticity or intrinsic values. The pitfall extends into identity formation. Personal beliefs, choices, and preferences may be unconsciously shaped by the anticipation of approval or disapproval. Decisions are filtered through imagined judgments. What will others think? Will they approve or reject me? This constant evaluation constrains spontaneity, creativity, and self-expression. Social perception becomes more influential than lived experience, and the mind loses distinction between authentic desire and adaptive performance. Identity becomes a reflection of perceived external standards, a construct continually reinforced by feedback loops of validation and doubt. Breaking free from illusory social validation requires conscious discernment. Awareness must recognize the difference between genuine connection and internally projected significance. Observing reactions without automatic attribution of meaning, questioning the influence of external perception on decision-making, and cultivating self-referential criteria for value diminishes the pitfall's grip. Consciousness learns to participate in social interaction without dependency on approval, retaining sensitivity without surrendering autonomy. The pitfall also reveals the duality of social cognition. Sensitivity to others' perceptions enables empathy, cooperation, and learning. Yet when internalized excessively, it constrains freedom, distorts self-perception, and magnifies anxiety. The challenge lies in maintaining awareness of social signals while preventing them from dictating the mind's internal landscape. Consciousness must navigate the tension between connection and autonomy, using insight rather than compulsion to guide behavior. Ultimately, illusory social validation reshapes consciousness by exposing the fragile boundary between internal identity and external perception. It demonstrates how attention, expectation, and interpretation coalesce to produce self-concepts dependent on others' approval. Through observation, discernment, and cultivation of intrinsic valuation, consciousness disentangles from the loop, reclaiming agency and authenticity. Social interaction transforms from a source of validation into a field of engagement, where connection is experienced freely, not demanded. and the mind inhabits a space of equilibrium between awareness of others and fidelity to the self. Consciousness is naturally attuned to evaluation, seeking to measure, assess, and situate experiences and self-perception relative to others. Yet this tendency can trap the mind in the comparison mirage, a mental pitfall in which attention is persistently drawn to how one measures up, creating illusions of deficiency, superiority, or stagnation. At first, it is subtle, noticing someone's skill, achievement, or appearance, and feeling a fleeting envy, pride, or self-doubt. Over time, however, the mind constructs elaborate narratives in which personal worth, competence, or success is contingent on relative comparison rather than intrinsic reality. The mirage operates through selective attention and interpretation. Consciousness focuses on what appears to be gaps, disparities, or advantages in others, often ignoring personal growth, effort, or context. Achievements of peers are magnified, while personal successes are minimized or rationalized. Social media, cultural expectations, and past experiences act as amplifiers, reinforcing the tendency to measure, contrast, and evaluate incessantly. Each perceived discrepancy triggers emotion, envy, anxiety, or pride that reinforces attention to the comparison, creating a cyclical pattern in which the mind repeatedly evaluates self against others. Emotion magnifies the effect. Envy heightens perceived deficiencies, creating longing or resentment. Pride can inflate achievements beyond realistic proportion, reinforcing detachment from authentic experience. Anxiety intensifies concern about judgment, rejection, or falling short. Even neutral observations of difference are interpreted through the lens of personal significance, producing subtle but persistent tension. Over time, consciousness becomes habituated to measuring, ranking, and contrasting, producing internal narratives that drive thought and behavior even when external reality is neutral or irrelevant. The pitfall also distorts self-perception and decision-making. Choices may be driven not by intrinsic motivation or values, but by perceived social hierarchy or imagined benchmarks. Career paths, relationships, and creative endeavors may be influenced by comparison rather than personal desire. Consciousness becomes externally tethered, with self-worth fluctuating based on relative standing, perpetuating cycles of dissatisfaction or overcompensation. The mind experiences a sense of insufficiency, achievement, or pride that is contingent, unstable, and largely illusory. Breaking free from the comparison mirage requires conscious recognition of evaluative bias. Awareness must extend to the subtle ways attention and emotion are drawn into relative assessment, observing the patterns without judgment or attachment. Shifting focus from external reference points to intrinsic experience, effort, and growth allows consciousness to disengage from the mirage. Practices such as mindfulness, self-reflection, and gratitude cultivate internal benchmarks, reducing reliance on fluctuating external measures. Consciousness learns to navigate perception without being dominated by the ceaseless comparison of self to others. The mirage also highlights the mind's capacity for growth and adaptation. Comparison is not inherently destructive. It provides feedback, motivation, and perspective. The challenge is discerning when evaluative attention serves development versus when it creates illusion. Consciousness learns that self-worth, achievement, and satisfaction emerge not from relative metrics, but from engagement with personal values, goals, and lived experience. Ultimately, the comparison mirage reshapes consciousness by revealing how perception, attention, and emotion conspire to create illusory hierarchies. It teaches that evaluation is a tool, not a directive, and that freedom arises when the mind observes differences without being ensnared by them. By disentangling from the mirage, consciousness experiences authenticity, presence, and clarity, navigating the complex landscape of human experience without the distortions of relative judgment. The pursuit of perfection can inspire growth, skill, and achievement. Yet it harbors a subtle but insidious mental pitfall: the perfectionism trap. This occurs when consciousness becomes fixated on flawlessness, evaluating every thought, action, and outcome against impossible standards. At first, the trap seems productive, motivating careful attention, preparation, and diligence. Yet over time, the mind becomes enslaved to its own ideals, experiencing dissatisfaction, self-criticism, and stagnation. Each perceived imperfection is magnified, reinforcing anxiety and eroding the ability to act freely, explore creatively, or accept the natural variability of life. The trap operates through rigid evaluation. Consciousness constantly scans experience for errors, omissions, or deviations from an idealized standard, whether real or imagined. Successes are rarely fully acknowledged. They are measured against benchmarks that often shift or remain unattainable. Mistakes, no matter how minor, generate disproportionate self-recrimination, producing loops of rumination and emotional tension. Over time, perfectionism becomes a self-reinforcing system. The more one seeks flawlessness, the more flaws are detected, and the more flaws are detected, the more the mind tightens its grip on control and evaluation. Emotion intensifies the effect. Anxiety, fear of judgment, and anticipation of failure heighten sensitivity to errors and imperfections. Shame and guilt amplify self-criticism, reinforcing compulsive checking, revising, or avoidance. Even moments of competence or achievement are overshadowed by a subtle sense of inadequacy as consciousness compares itself to internalized ideals. Perfectionism becomes not merely a goal, but a constant lens through which thought, perception, and emotion are filtered, shaping identity and behavior with unrelenting pressure. The pitfall extends to creativity, relationships, and decision-making. Hesitation, overanalysis, and fear of making mistakes can prevent engagement, experimentation, or risk-taking. Communication and collaboration may be constrained by hypercriticism or unrealistic expectations of others. Consciousness becomes preoccupied with controlling outcomes, polishing results, and minimizing error, often at the expense of authenticity, spontaneity, and experiential richness. The trap produces a paradox. The very pursuit of excellence undermines flexibility, satisfaction, and growth. Breaking free from the perfectionism trap requires awareness, acceptance, and reframing. Consciousness must recognize the habitual patterns of self-criticism and over-evaluation, observing them without immediate reaction. Shifting focus from flawless outcomes to effort, process, and learning allows the mind to engage constructively rather than compulsively. Mindfulness, self-compassion, and iterative experimentation provide practical pathways to loosen rigidity, fostering engagement with life as it unfolds rather than as an idealized projection. The trap also illuminates a profound aspect of consciousness: the interplay between aspiration and limitation. Perfectionism demonstrates the mind's capacity for reflection, foresight, and refinement. Yet it reveals the danger of conflating ideals with reality. True growth and mastery emerge not from flawless performance, but from the ability to navigate imperfection, learn from experience, and cultivate resilience in the face of inevitable mistakes. Consciousness learns that excellence is dynamic, evolving, and contextually grounded, not static or absolute. Ultimately, the perfectionism trap reshapes consciousness by highlighting the tension between aspiration and acceptance. It teaches that rigid pursuit of flawlessness constrains thought, emotion, and action, producing loops of dissatisfaction and inhibition. By observing, reframing, and embracing imperfection, consciousness transforms the trap into a space of deliberate growth, creativity, and presence. The mind learns to act, create, and engage without being imprisoned by impossible ideals, finding balance between striving and being, effort and acceptance, ambition and authentic experience. The mind has a remarkable capacity to reflect, analyze, and rehearse experiences. Yet this strength can become a trap in the form of the mental rumination spiral, a pitfall where consciousness repeatedly cycles through thoughts, events, or possibilities without resolution. At first, rumination may appear constructive, providing insight or problem-solving. Over time, however, it becomes a self-reinforcing loop, amplifying anxiety, regret, or obsession, and constraining the mind's ability to engage with the present. The spiral deepens as attention is continually drawn back to familiar mental territory, reinforcing patterns of thought, rather than producing clarity or closure. The mechanism is deceptively simple. The mind latches onto unresolved experiences, questions, or emotions, replaying them with subtle variations. Each loop intensifies emotional response, increasing focus and attachment. Minor uncertainties or disappointments expand in perceived importance as the mind magnifies consequences, reinterprets interactions, or speculates on alternative outcomes. Consciousness becomes trapped in its own reflections, mistaking repetition for progress, while the original concern remains unresolved or is transformed into an additional source of stress. Emotion amplifies the spiral. Anxiety, guilt, and regret produce heightened attention, creating recursive loops that entangle cognition and feeling. Even positive experiences may be ruminated upon, as the mind seeks validation, understanding, or anticipation of judgment. The spiral generates tension and fatigue, as consciousness becomes increasingly focused on internal repetition rather than external engagement. Patterns once productive for learning or planning evolve into compulsive cycles that distort perception, inflate worry, and hinder effective action. Social dynamics can exacerbate rumination. Interactions, perceived slights, or imagined judgments may be endlessly replayed in the mind, producing secondary loops of interpretation and evaluation. Each social encounter becomes both stimulus and subject for reflection, further entrenching attention in the spiral. The mind's constant review of behavior, words, or emotional responses can distort reality, producing a sense of entrapment within imagined or exaggerated outcomes. Consciousness becomes a stage for endless internal narrative, blurring boundaries between memory, speculation, and immediate experience. Breaking free from the mental rumination spiral requires awareness and deliberate interruption. Consciousness must recognize repetitive patterns, observing thoughts without immediate engagement or judgment. Techniques such as grounding in the present, redirecting attention to tangible action, or reframing mental narratives reduce recursive reinforcement. By observing rumination as a phenomenon rather than a directive, the mind begins to release the loops, creating space for reflection that is constructive rather than compulsive. The pitfall also highlights the mind's capacity for insight and foresight. Rumination demonstrates the ability to analyze, anticipate, and evaluate, revealing consciousness's reflective power. Yet the challenge lies in balancing reflection with release, to learn from the past and anticipate the future without being imprisoned by mental replay. Consciousness must navigate between observation and obsession, insight and fixation, understanding that repetition alone does not equate to resolution. Ultimately, the mental rumination spiral reshapes consciousness by revealing the recursive nature of thought and emotion. It demonstrates how attention, memory, and anticipation can conspire to trap the mind in cycles of internal repetition. By cultivating awareness, mindful observation, and strategic disengagement, consciousness can transform the spiral from a source of entrapment into a tool for deliberate reflection, clarity, and presence. The mind learns to navigate loops of thought without being consumed by them, reclaiming agency, equanimity, and freedom within the ever-flowing landscape of consciousness. The mind possesses an extraordinary capacity to anticipate, plan, and predict. Yet this capability can ensnare consciousness in the obsessive anticipation loop, a mental pitfall in which thoughts perpetually fixate on future events, outcomes, or possibilities. At first, anticipation seems beneficial, preparing, strategizing, or imagining potential scenarios. Over time, however, the mind becomes trapped in recursive projections, generating anxiety, tension, and emotional volatility. Consciousness is caught between present reality and imagined futures, constantly oscillating and rarely resting in the now. The loop operates through the mind's focus on expectation. Each imagined scenario produces emotional response, which reinforces attention and increases mental investment. Minor uncertainties are magnified. Possibilities are endlessly analyzed, and even neutral or positive events are interpreted through the lens of potential risk or reward. The more the mind anticipates, the more it rehearses outcomes, deepening the loop and creating a sense that the future is already partially determined by internal fixation. Consciousness becomes simultaneously participant and observer, unable to disentangle real experience from projection. Emotion intensifies the pitfall. Anxiety heightens vigilance and anticipation, amplifying mental rehearsal. Desire intensifies longing for preferred outcomes, producing restlessness or impatience. Fear magnifies potential loss, disappointment, or failure, creating a loop of heightened sensitivity and persistent mental focus. Even moments of certainty or calm are overshadowed by subtle engagement with projected possibilities. The mind perceives itself as active in shaping outcomes, yet this engagement paradoxically produces stress, distraction, and reduced efficacy. Social and environmental factors exacerbate the loop. Interpersonal interactions, responsibilities, and external pressures become additional stimuli for anticipatory thinking. Conversations, deadlines, and perceived expectations are mentally replayed and analyzed, extending the spiral of focus on potential outcomes. The mind constructs scenarios of approval, rejection, or consequence, often amplifying perceived stakes beyond reality. Each reinforcement cycle increases entanglement, creating habitual patterns in which anticipation dominates attention, shaping both perception and behavior. Breaking free requires conscious observation and temporal grounding. Awareness must recognize the loop as a mental phenomenon, distinct from immediate reality. Practices such as mindfulness, focused attention on present activity, and intentional disengagement from speculative scenarios interrupt recursive patterns. By observing anticipation without attachment or compulsion, consciousness reduces reinforcement of the loop, allowing attention to return to lived experience rather than imagined outcomes. The pitfall also reveals the mind's extraordinary capacity for foresight, creativity, and preparation. Anticipation allows problem-solving, planning, and adaptive strategy, yet when unmoderated, it becomes a source of entrapment rather than empowerment. Consciousness must balance projection with presence, using anticipation as a tool for effective engagement rather than a driver of anxiety or compulsion. Ultimately, the obsessive anticipation loop reshapes consciousness by demonstrating the recursive interplay between thought, emotion, and projected reality. It illustrates how the mind can become both architect and prisoner of imagined futures. By cultivating awareness, temporal grounding, and mindful observation, consciousness disentangles from compulsive projection, reclaiming freedom, presence, and equanimity. The mind learns to anticipate without obsession, plan without paralysis, and navigate potential futures while remaining rooted in the immediate landscape of experience. Consciousness possesses a survival-oriented tendency to focus on threats, errors, and adverse outcomes. While this bias historically aided adaptation, it can evolve into a mental pitfall known as the negativity bias spiral, where the mind disproportionately emphasizes negative experiences, interpretations, and possibilities. At first, the spiral appears subtle, noticing a slight criticism, a minor mistake, or a fleeting sense of danger. Over time, however, attention becomes dominated by negative information, shaping perception, emotion, and behavior, while suppressing acknowledgement of neutral or positive experiences. Consciousness becomes immersed in patterns of worry, dissatisfaction, and pessimism, often amplifying minor threats into perceived catastrophes. The spiral operates through selective attention and interpretation. The mind continuously scans for negative cues, exaggerates their significance, and interprets ambiguous events as adverse. Each identified threat triggers emotional responses such as anxiety, frustration, or fear, which reinforce attention to negativity. This creates a recursive loop. The more the mind focuses on potential harm, the more it perceives risk, and the more risk is perceived, the stronger the emotional reinforcement becomes. Even minor setbacks or uncertainties gain disproportionate weight in mental and emotional processing. Emotion intensifies the effect. Fear and worry heighten sensitivity to negative cues, producing hypervigilance and anticipation of worst-case scenarios. Frustration and resentment amplify perceived slights or injustices. The mind's reaction to negative interpretation becomes self-reinforcing, generating ongoing cycles of rumination, stress, and hyper-awareness. Even small disruptions in routine, social interaction, or personal expectation can trigger extended engagement with negative patterns, producing persistent tension and emotional fatigue. Social and relational factors further entrench the spiral. Critical feedback, subtle judgments, or perceived rejection are amplified and replayed, while affirmations or positive reinforcement are downplayed or ignored. Interpersonal interactions become filtered through negativity, producing misunderstandings, conflict, or isolation. The mind's selective attention reinforces its own perception of adversity, creating a feedback loop that amplifies both internal and external focus on threat and deficiency. Breaking free from the negativity bias spiral requires conscious intervention. Awareness must extend to the mind's selective patterns, observing negative focus without automatic reinforcement. Practices such as gratitude, reframing, and attention redirection cultivate recognition of neutral or positive experiences, balancing perception. Consciousness learns to contextualize negative information without allowing it to dominate experience, reducing the spiral's intensity. The pitfall also illuminates the adaptive nature of consciousness. Sensitivity to potential harm or error is valuable for learning, survival, and decision-making. The challenge lies in calibrating perception. To remain alert without becoming trapped in excessive negativity, to recognize risk without surrendering to emotional domination. Consciousness gains insight into its own attentional biases, developing flexibility and discernment. Ultimately, the negativity bias spiral reshapes consciousness by revealing the disproportionate influence of adverse information on perception and emotion. It demonstrates how recursive attention and emotional reinforcement can create self-sustaining patterns of pessimism and anxiety. By cultivating awareness, reframing, and balanced attention, consciousness disentangles from the spiral, reclaiming clarity, equanimity, and freedom. The mind learns to perceive threats without being consumed, to acknowledge challenges without exaggerating them, and to navigate experience with both caution and openness. Consciousness is designed to process vast amounts of information, yet it is limited in capacity. When too much data, thought, or stimulus is processed simultaneously, the mind becomes ensnared in the cognitive overload web, a mental pitfall where attention, decision-making, and comprehension are impaired. At first, overload appears subtly: difficulty focusing, minor forgetfulness, or indecision. Over time, however, the mind struggles under the weight of continuous information, producing fatigue, anxiety, and a distorted perception of reality. Consciousness is pulled in multiple directions, creating tension between processing, reflection, and action. The web operates through simultaneous engagement with competing cognitive demands. The mind attempts to evaluate, store, and respond to multiple streams of information. But processing limits prevent effective integration. Priorities are mismanaged, attention is fragmented, and even simple decisions become challenging. Mental effort multiplies exponentially as consciousness tries to account for every variable, context, and consequence. Each attempt to regain clarity is hampered by the constant influx of data, creating a feedback loop in which effort intensifies overload rather than resolving it. Emotion amplifies the effect. Anxiety and frustration arise from perceived inefficiency or misunderstanding. Fear of error, judgment, or missed opportunity heightens attention to competing demands, increasing mental strain. Even small distractions produce disproportionate tension as the mind struggles to allocate resources across multiple focal points. Over time, cognitive overload undermines confidence, diminishes clarity, and produces a sense of entrapment, as consciousness struggles to maintain control while simultaneously feeling dispersed. Social and environmental factors exacerbate the web. Interactions, obligations, digital stimuli, and external expectations contribute to continuous input, often exceeding processing capacity. Multitasking, constant notifications, or simultaneous responsibilities fragment attention further. Each external stimulus triggers additional evaluation, response, or reflection, strengthening the web's complexity and reinforcing the pitfall's self-perpetuating nature. Consciousness becomes entangled, oscillating between stimulus and response, unable to prioritize effectively. Breaking free from the cognitive overload web requires awareness and structured management. Consciousness must recognize the limits of processing capacity, observing attempts to manage excessive input without self-judgment. Intentional focus, prioritization, and simplification of cognitive load reduce tension. Techniques such as chunking information, scheduled reflection, and controlled engagement with stimuli restore clarity. Mindful attention to present experience counteracts dispersion, allowing consciousness to operate within its capacities rather than against them. The pitfall also highlights the duality of cognitive power. The mind's ability to process information, learn, and adapt is extraordinary, yet it has finite limits. The challenge lies in balancing engagement with capacity, using intelligence and awareness without exceeding functional thresholds. Consciousness learns that clarity, insight, and decision-making require not just effort, but discernment, structure, and selective attention. Ultimately, the cognitive overload web reshapes consciousness by revealing the limits and vulnerabilities of mental processing. It demonstrates how simultaneous demands, excessive input, and divided attention can entrap thought and perception. By cultivating awareness, prioritization, and focus, consciousness disentangles from overload, reclaiming clarity, agency, and equanimity. The mind learns to navigate complexity without being consumed, to process information effectively without surrendering to chaos, and to inhabit mental space with both discipline and flexibility. Consciousness often seeks stability, continuity, and certainty. Yet this instinct can entrap the mind in the illusion of permanence, a mental pitfall where transient experiences, relationships, or achievements are perceived as fixed or eternal. At first, the illusion seems comforting. Believing that a moment, a connection, or a state of being will last provides a sense of security. Over time, however, the mind becomes anchored to impermanence perceived as permanence, producing shock, denial, and emotional suffering when inevitable change occurs. Consciousness clings to what is fleeting, creating tension between expectation and reality. The pitfall operates through attachment and selective perception. Consciousness emphasizes stability in memory, projection, and judgment, overestimating duration or significance of experiences. Moments of joy, success, or connection are internalized as enduring, while challenges or disruptions are minimized or denied. The mind constructs narratives that suggest permanence, reinforcing attachment and reducing preparedness for change. Each observed consistency, no matter how fleeting, strengthens the illusion, creating a self-reinforcing pattern in which impermanence is ignored or resisted. Emotion magnifies the effect. Desire, attachment, and fear heighten focus on retention, producing anxiety about loss or disruption. Nostalgia inflates past experiences, while anticipation of continuity intensifies present dependence. Even positive experiences become sources of subtle tension, as the mind projects their permanence and experiences subtle dread about eventual change. Consciousness oscillates between attachment and apprehension, generating emotional loops that reinforce the illusion rather than clarity. Social and relational factors contribute to the pitfall. Beliefs about enduring relationships, reputations, or social status amplify perceived permanence. Expectations about commitments, achievements, or external circumstances are projected as stable, reinforcing reliance on assumed continuity. When change occurs through loss, evolution, or unpredictability, consciousness experiences disorientation, grief, or resentment, highlighting the tension between expectation and reality. The illusion, once protective, becomes restrictive and destabilizing. Breaking free from the illusion of permanence requires conscious recognition of transience. Awareness must extend to the ephemeral nature of experiences, relationships, and personal states. Observing moments without over-identifying, embracing change as natural, and cultivating adaptability reduce attachment to perceived permanence. Consciousness begins to inhabit the present fully, appreciating the temporality of all phenomena while maintaining equanimity amid change. The pitfall also reveals consciousness' capacity for resilience and growth. While attachment to permanence can produce suffering, it also fosters attention, investment, and appreciation. The challenge lies in balancing engagement with awareness of impermanence. To love, create, and participate without clinging, and to plan and anticipate without rigidity. Consciousness learns that permanence is a perception, not a reality, and that freedom arises when experiences are embraced in their true transient form. Ultimately, the illusion of permanence reshapes consciousness by illuminating the tension between desire for stability and the reality of constant change. It teaches that attachment to permanence generates suffering, while recognition of transience fosters presence, clarity, and adaptability. By observing impermanence, cultivating acceptance, and releasing over-identification with fleeting states, consciousness navigates life with freedom, insight, and grace. The mind learns to appreciate moments fully, engage without clinging, and inhabit existence with awareness of its fluid, ever-changing nature. Consciousness possesses the remarkable ability to reflect upon itself, to observe, analyze, and question its own processes. Yet this capacity can become a mental pitfall known as the self-referential thought loop, a recursive trap where awareness continually turns inward, analyzing its own thoughts, beliefs, and perceptions in an endless cycle. At first, the loop may seem insightful, fostering introspection, understanding, and self-improvement. Over time, however, the mind becomes ensnared, producing analysis without resolution, reflection without clarity, and observation without rest. Consciousness becomes both subject and observer, perpetually caught in its own cognitive machinery. The mechanism is deceptively intricate. Each thought generates meta-thoughts, reflections on accuracy, value, or implication. Each observation of awareness triggers evaluation of the observation itself. Minor doubts, questions, or curiosities escalate into extended recursive analysis. The mind constructs layers upon layers of self-examination, reinforcing attention inward rather than outward. Emotional responses, anxiety, guilt, uncertainty, or pride interact with cognition, producing recursive loops that intensify entanglement. Even attempts to disengage or find clarity often generate new reflections, perpetuating the cycle. Emotion amplifies the trap. Self-consciousness produces tension and hyper-awareness. Fear of error magnifies each judgment, and desire for understanding fuels deeper introspection. Anxiety about adequacy, coherence, or correctness heightens engagement with internal loops. Even curiosity or wonder, when unmoderated, becomes entangled with the loop, reinforcing repetitive patterns. Consciousness experiences simultaneous fascination and frustration, caught in cycles that both illuminate and obscure. Social and cognitive factors further entrench the loop. Awareness of external perception, social expectation, or potential judgment feeds recursive self-analysis. Observing how thoughts might be interpreted by others or anticipating consequences of internal deliberation extends and complicates the cycle. Memory and expectation also intertwine, producing multi-layered loops in which reflection, projection, and evaluation interlace. Consciousness becomes a hall of mirrors, where every thought reflects upon itself infinitely. Breaking free requires meta-awareness. Coupled with intentional disengagement, consciousness must recognize recursive patterns as phenomena rather than imperatives. Observing thoughts without immediate evaluation, cultivating presence in sensory experience, and redirecting attention toward external engagement interrupts the loop. Mindfulness and deliberate action create boundaries, allowing introspection without entrapment and observation without compulsion. The mind learns to reflect strategically rather than endlessly, using insight rather than obsession. The pitfall also illuminates consciousness's unique power. Self-referential thought enables reflection, moral reasoning, planning, and creativity. Yet when unmoderated, it becomes self-consuming, producing cycles that obscure clarity and impede action. The challenge lies in balancing reflection with direct experience, observation with engagement, and awareness with presence. Consciousness must learn that some understanding arises not from endless contemplation, but from interaction with reality, practice, and lived experience. Ultimately, the self-referential thought loop reshapes consciousness by revealing the recursive nature of awareness. It demonstrates how the mind can become both observer and prisoner of itself, entangled in patterns that are simultaneously insightful and constraining. By cultivating awareness, deliberate presence, and strategic reflection, consciousness disentangles from infinite recursion, reclaiming clarity, equanimity, and freedom. The mind learns to observe itself without being trapped, to reflect without compulsion, and to inhabit awareness as a tool for growth, insight, and intentional engagement with life. As we journey through the 25 mental pitfalls that subtly, yet profoundly, reshape consciousness, a pattern emerges. The mind is both a masterful creator and an unwitting trapper. Each pitfall, from the fragmented attention spiral to the self-referential thought loop, reveals a duality within consciousness, its extraordinary capacity for reflection, imagination, and adaptation, and its equally remarkable ability to entangle itself in recursive, distorted, or exaggerated patterns. What becomes clear is that these pitfalls are not mere weaknesses, they are the shadowed companions of cognition, intrinsic to the architecture of thought and perception. By observing them, understanding their mechanisms, and recognizing their emotional amplifiers, consciousness gains the potential not only to identify its own traps, but to navigate beyond them. Each mental pitfall teaches a distinct lesson about attention, emotion, and perception. Some ensnare through overestimation of control, projection of permanence, or obsessive rumination. Others distort self-perception through comparison, perfectionism, or the craving for social validation. Time, memory, and awareness themselves become instruments of entanglement, reshaping experience according to subjective interpretation rather than objective flow. Collectively, these pitfalls illustrate the delicate tension between the mind's constructive and destructive tendencies. Awareness, reflection, and presence emerge as the antidotes. By observing without attachment, discerning patterns without judgment, and engaging intentionally with experience, consciousness can transform pitfalls into pathways of insight. Yet this transformation is neither simple nor instantaneous. The pitfalls are not external obstacles. They are woven into the very fabric of thought. Liberation arises not through elimination, but through integration. By acknowledging the mind's tendencies without resistance, embracing impermanence, and cultivating discernment, consciousness begins to operate with greater clarity and balance. The loops, spirals, and webs become teachers rather than prisons, revealing the interplay between perception and reality, desire and acceptance, reflection and action. Through careful observation, one recognizes that the mind's distortions are also its instruments for creativity, adaptation, and understanding. Ultimately, the exploration of these 25 pitfalls is an invitation to conscious evolution. It is a call to inhabit awareness with deliberate presence, to recognize recurring patterns without being controlled by them, and to cultivate an intimate understanding of the self's architecture. Awareness becomes both a mirror and a compass, a mirror reflecting habitual patterns, and a compass guiding attention, choice, and engagement with reality. By integrating lessons from each pitfall, consciousness gains resilience against entanglement, clarity in perception, and freedom from compulsive reaction. In the final reckoning, the mind is neither enemy nor master. It is a landscape to be explored. The pitfalls are signposts along the journey, each highlighting areas of vulnerability, yet simultaneously offering insight, understanding, and growth. Consciousness that observes these patterns learns to navigate the delicate terrain of thought and emotion with equanimity, curiosity, and intentionality. Life is not the absence of pitfalls, but the cultivation of awareness that allows one to traverse them skillfully. In this integration, the mind discovers its true potential, to observe without obsession, to engage without entrapment, and to participate in the unfolding of existence with clarity, presence, and profound understanding.